Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Delmarva poultry industry is bracing for the avian flu. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Over the past year, 48 million birds have been killed by the avian flu, most of them Midwest and out in the West. So far, Delmarva's $1 billion poultry industry has remained untouched. The Maryland Department of Agriculture and poultry growers are making preparations with the expected southern migration of wildfowl this fall as they make their annual journey. In Maryland, officials are set to impose a series of restrictions on the poultry industry to try to stave off the disease. Our in-studio guest, Bill Satterfield, is Executive Director of Delmarva Poultry Industry Incorporated, a regional trade group. Also, Lee Richardson, he is a local grower. And Dr. Joe Chapman is the Assistant State Veterinarian at the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Well, Joe, I want to start with you to talk a little bit about how serious is this situation for Delmarva. So far, we've been untouched. At least I think the last case was a number of years back during another problem there. What's the state doing? What kind of restrictions are we looking at? How serious is this?
Let me start with the first. It's very serious. We, in Delmarva, that includes the industry and Maryland Department of Agriculture, Delaware Department of Agriculture, Virginia Department of Agriculture, all are assuming that we will have the high-path avian influenza strain in our area this fall when the birds come down from the northern breeding grounds. It has been in the 3 flyways in the U.S. in the spring, and they all mix in the summer at the breeding grounds. So we are taking a worst-case approach to this and assuming we will have to deal with the virus being in our area. Now, whether or not it infects a commercial or a backyard flock is somewhat luck, somewhat how much biosecurity we use at the farm. So we're taking measures to prevent infection, assuming it will be in the ducks, geese that pass through our area. And there's a number of steps. So you want me to walk through all those?
Well, let me ask you, before we go through the steps, let me ask you this. Why is it that we've been untouched, do you think?
God only knows. Because, it did start from China. This strain is a combination of a strain from China and a strain of a North American strain. So it started in the Pacific Northwest in Canada last December. So it's moved through the migratory bird population. So it kind of makes sense that the East Coast might not have gotten affected as soon as the West Coast, the Central, and the Mississippi flyways. We were actually surprised to see it go as far as it did last spring. We were hoping it stayed in the Pacific, but it did not. So now that it's in the Central Mississippi, those birds are more likely to mix with Atlantic flyway birds.
So what kind of steps is the state of Maryland taking?
So we are looking to control or prevent this problem by a combination of steps. We want to have early detection, rapid response and control, and we want to also have a recovery plan to get people back in business as soon as possible. We've always done surveillance at a high level on the Eastern Shore. With the cooperation of industry, we test every flock that goes to slaughter. We test every flock that has an increase in mortality. We've even increased that surveillance, almost doubled in some of the smaller commercial flocks. So we are looking for it. If it's out there, we should be able to find it. We have a control method that has been practiced with our partners in industry in other states. We've done this for years, but we've increased our work response force, if you will, bringing more people in. The Department of Agriculture, both in Delaware and Maryland, have both purchased these machines we use for depopulation, with the help of industry contributions, by the way, that will give us more equipment to work with. We're stockpiling equipment. We are training and recertifying people who can help. And we act like a fire department. If we have a suspect positive, we will go out same day. Within an hour, we will be loading up and going out. And we plan to stamp out the disease at the first flock that is there, with the idea that we'll keep it from spreading.
Now, there's also been what bans on displaying poultry and some quarantine orders in terms of egg hatchings and testing within 10 days, I guess. What's that about?
So we've modified our regulations. We don't let anyone come into our state without testing within 10 days. And that just gives us a little better control that birds coming in are not sick. We require testing of birds going to fairs and shows, and those are the usually the county fairs and the state fair, but we decided to go ahead and discontinue poultry exhibitions after August 25th with the migratory season starting in September. So unfortunately, there won't be poultry exhibitions at the state fair or through June next year, when we still have to be concerned about this. We also have some new requirements, which are things that the industry already does, biosecurity requirements, but we want to make sure everyone uses them. This is a requirement to secure the entry into the poultry area, and that can either be by a sign or a gate. Common sense sort of thing, but not something that always happens. People like to invite people into their poultry farms, and that's a way to spread disease. So we want people to minimize the visitors on their farms. We want them to use sanitation, that is changing their footwear or otherwise having cover footwear when they go into a poultry house and changing it out so they aren't spreading whatever's in the house or they aren't bringing something into their house. We want them to cover their feed or keep their feed as clean as possible. That is one of the ways they may have gotten infected in some of the farms in the Midwest by infected feed from the waterfowl that carry the disease. So keep it as clean as possible on the farm, and then cover any diseased carcasses or other materials that can spread disease. We have a lot of buzzards in the area. That's one thing that's an example of something that might carry a disease from farm to farm. Those are the main requirements that we have that by law, but there's many, many biosecurity things that can be done that are recommended.
Bill Satterfield with the Delmarva Poultry Industry Incorporated. I want to turn to you. You obviously are like an entire region. We're just talking about Maryland. How is Delaware dealing with this? Is it comparable? What's going on up there?
Much of what Dr. Chapman just said applies to Delaware and Virginia. Perfect example. Yesterday at the Delaware Department of Agriculture, there was a planning meeting. Dr. Chapman's boss, the state veterinarian for Maryland, was there. People are working together as if it is one state. And for response purposes, it really is one state, because if something is found in Maryland, Delaware and Virginia officials would go on a higher level of alert. So it really is a regional approach, coordination of resources, people, response plans. There's a Delmarva response plan, not just a Delaware, not just a Maryland, not just an Eastern Shore, Virginia response plan, a Delmarva response plan. And we're all working together. We're all on the same team.
Now, I guess it was at 2004. I guess there was a couple of outbreaks in two Delaware farms. About 200,000 chickens, I guess, were killed and composted inside the chicken houses. Some quarantine zones put around it. Is that kind of the kind of response do you think we should expect this next time out, if indeed it does show up?
Oh, yes. Back in 2004, it was a low pathogenic avian influenza virus. This is a highly pathogenic avian influenza virus that we've been seeing in the Midwest and the left coast. When we had this incident in 2004, we kind of developed plans as we went along. The emergency response industry that exists today did not exist back then. So we went along, made plans, changed plans, implemented things, and it was an industry-led effort, because the industry, the private sector, has the most to lose if there is an outbreak or an incident, because that's their business. No disparagement to the government employees, but they'll have jobs after an incident is over. The poultry industry and growers like Lee Richardson and Bill Brown could suffer tremendous hardship. So the industry worked hard in 2011 and is still working cooperatively with the state departments of agriculture, plus the state health departments, plus the emergency management agencies, plus the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and anybody else who has resources and training ability and experience in how to deal with emergencies.
Before we get to my growers, I wanted to shift back to you, Joe, for just a moment, because Bill's touched on a observation that was made, I guess, by one of the folks at the Centers for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, where he says basically the virus is doing things we've never seen it do before. I mean, they're talking about this as extremely virulent, extremely transmission-wise. How dangerous is this?
So I think of it, again, as a fire. The birds can be standing and looking healthy 1 hour, and 2 hours later they'll be down, and 4 hours later the majority will be dead. It goes that fast. But the other problem we have with this disease, if you will, is that it has a longer incubation period than we're used to, so you won't know it's there for a number of days. Usually we think of 3 to 4 days for incubation. It's going up to as long as 8 days. That gives you 8 days for people to spread the disease to other farms, and then you know you have it. So one of the things we do is we have an agreement in our surveillance plan that if you have an uptick of more than 3 or more per 1,000 increase in mortality or morbidity sickness, we test those birds right off. And that the industry doesn't wait. They actually bring them in earlier usually, because you know your flock. You know if there's something off. And they bring them into our lab and we test them right away. We don't wait. We don't wait to see if that is the disease. We check every sick bird pretty much for avian influenza. But it did cause a problem, I think, initially in some of the flocks out west. They probably weren't surveilling as tightly as we do. We have a denser population, and we've had this emergency planning going on for 10 years, and we're on a little more heightened alert, I think, all the time.
I want to turn to our growers. There's Lee Richardson, who's also a grower, as well as Bill Brown, who's a grower. Bill, I want to turn to you. So this sounds like a real scary situation, at least in terms of the poultry industry. I mean, not only are we talking about a disease that's obviously serious, but when they're talking about something that's doing things that we've never seen this kind of disease do before, would you sit there a bit scared about what may happen to your flocks?
Well, my wife and I, are monitoring poultry health is just a normal part of doing business. And, this virus is a second cousin to many viruses that we already deal with. Its mode of the way it is passed is very similar. While I will agree with Dr. Chapman that this virus certainly appears to be much more virulent, much more quick reacting. We've not seen anything this hot. But there are things that, we're obviously concerned. We've looked into insurance to try to get business interruption insurance, and that's an issue. That's a national issue. That's being worked on. We've talked with our lenders. There are things such as you can make interest-only payments. You can extend your amortization period. And quite frankly, Lee and I, our farms, are really the first line of defense. And ultimately, Lee and I are responsible for that. So there's a lot of things that we can do at the farm level to kind of beef up. We mentioned this word biosecurity. So that's probably the hammer that we have. Just being very virulent about the other day. Using a concrete example, I have a neighbor that has backyard poultry, and they allow them to roam. And I've seen them on my property, so I actually took a copy of the Daily Times that had a front page article, and I sat down with them and said, listen, if you'll build a pen, I'll go halves with you. So my neighbor and I have been able to work that out, but it's really in my best interest that he do a very good job, because we know bird-to-bird contact is the number one way that this virus can be spread. And then second is people and equipment. And that's where Lee and I can, we can do things on our farm just to insist upon certain things that are, washing down of equipment, proper PPE, personal protective equipment. There's a lot of things that we can do, handling our mortality correctly. Dr. Chapman mentioned vultures. There's foxes and other types of vermin that can actually carry this virus. So we can do things in our production site to try to reduce or eliminate risk. So it's not like we don't have some things we can do.
Lee, what about you? I mean, is this to scare you a bit? I mean,
yeah, I mean, it gets scarier every day the more you hear about it. That it is our livelihood, and there is no at this time insurance to cover us. So in other words, if my farm gets it, I'm out of pay for several months until it tests clean. So not only do we have to be vigilant, but also our neighbors. That worries us a lot, because if they're not doing the biosecurity, it might not matter if we're doing it or not, if it's airborne, from them. So we have a lot of worries. It seems to be a lot worse this time than it was back in 2004. So, we're going to tighten up our security as far as people on the farm and equipment and washing our boots and stuff like that. And we have dedicated boots for the chicken house. So, we'll try to do everything we can to stop it from getting to ours. But it's a big concern if our neighbors get it too, and, they decide to eliminate a certain area, which might include us.
It's because you financially, I mean, if your flock is wiped out, does that necessarily put you out of business, or you've got enough leeway to be able to get to the next step? I mean, what's that financial process like?
Well, for some of it all depends on what position the grower's in. I mean, I can go a while. My chicken houses happen to be paid for, luckily, so I can survive for a little bit. But ones that are just building chicken houses today, you've seen several going up. I'd be real scared if I was in their position right now, because if it was to hit them, they don't have anything. So, but they've still somewhat got to make payments eventually. So it depends on how long they're kept out, until their houses test clean, and then the close area, to be able to start growing chickens again. So it can put some out of business, I would say. And,
Bill Satterfield, what about that? Is there any kind of preparation in terms of if this thing does come and you do lose your flock, is there any kind of financial cushion at all?
There is, to a degree. If a farm is found positive for the virus and those birds are ordered destroyed by the government has an obligation to pay the owner of the birds the value of those birds. Well, in our industry, the birds are owned by the chicken companies. Now, the chicken companies verbally have said they're going to take care of their growers. They may not get full pay as if the flock grew to the entire 7 or 8 week period, but the companies want to make sure that their growers are able to stay in business. And our grower committee sent a letter to the companies just the other day asking the companies, would you explain to your growers what your policies will be, so at least growers have some idea within that company what their arrangements will be. The private sector insurance that Lee mentioned does not exist. There's no government insurance like there is crop insurance for field crops. However, work is underway on both fronts to put some insurance protections in place. The Congress ordered the U.S. Department of Agriculture to conduct a study on the feasibility and mechanics of offering a chicken grower disease insurance program. And we have worked with the consultant for the USDA to get feedback to them, what would work, what's needed, what won't work. But going through a government is going to take months and months and maybe years to develop a program. But it is being studied. A few months ago, we reached out to the insurance agencies that are members of our organization and asked, do you have business interruption or loss of income insurance for chicken growers in case they have lost income because of avian influenza? Either virus found on their farm or they're in the nearby zone, the wrong place, wrong time guys, who through no fault of their own will suffer financial hardship. We heard back from one agent in Milford, Delaware, who has developed a program working with an underwriter in Indiana who's working with Lloyd's of London. However, there are some modifications needed to what he's put together because it does not cover all strains of avian influenza, just 4, and that needs to be brought into any highly pathogenic avian influenza virus as defined by U.S. Department of Agriculture. Another problem was that the cost. It could be over the heads of some growers. Now, as Lee said, if you have a mortgage and you don't have any income, you have a lot more financial obligation than a guy who doesn't have a mortgage. But you would still have insurance, taxes, wages, or any other operating costs. And so a grower has to ponder, well, is the premium I'm going to pay for 1 year's worth of coverage going to exceed my cost, or I have to balance this sort of thing out? So we're going to put together a fact sheet for growers of things they need to be asking if they consider grower insurance. But this is a very limited policy for a limited number of avian influenza strains. It does not cover all growers. If the growers ever, if the birds ever go out of the houses, such as the case with organic farms, part of Purdue, those birds will not be covered. So there are a lot of things that have to be worked out, but there is work going on.
The plans, by the way, that you're talking about, do they particular will focus or cover this particular strain that we're getting, or is it past? What's that?
There were in this particular policy, there were 4 strains of avian influenza that were mentioned. One in the Midwest that caused death is not included on that list. So that's why we've suggested that use the definition of highly pathogenic avian influenza as spelled out in the Code of Federal Regulations, and that way anything that comes in would be covered by the policy.
Let me ask you this, because this is not new. I mean, in the sense of this particular round, we saw it in the West, we saw it in the Midwest. What did they do in the Midwest? I mean, were they just simply financially wiped out? Is that what happened to them?
There's a lot of financial hardship out there, and one of the problems in the Midwest was they did not depopulate the birds quickly. And you have to depopulate the birds quickly because they serve as the host for the virus. Once the chicken is dead, the virus will not replicate. So you have to kill them quickly. They were not ready as we are. There were a lot of egg farms out there, birds in cages. Depopulating the birds was difficult and challenging. Just getting the birds out of the cages was a problem. Turkeys are 40 or 50 pounds. It's a whole lot more difficult. So yeah, there were some financial hardships. Now, in the Midwest, the cost incurred by the growers, Lee and Bill, for example, for depopulation, carcass disposal, cleaning and disinfecting, have some remuneration by the federal government. But it was taking days and weeks to get the paperwork filled out to allow those activities to occur. That did not help stop the virus from spreading. Our goal is to, within 24 hours, have those birds killed. And as one guy said the other day, we'd like to have them dead by supper time so we can go home and sleep easy. So we have a quicker plan to keep it from spreading, to keep it to one farm.
And I understand, by the way, the Midwest, a lot of the farms were egg-laying operations. My understanding is we're really kind of more broilers than anything else. I mean, does that make a difference, do you think, in anybody?
Well,
go ahead, Joe.
Yes, in that the majority of our flocks are broilers, and so they have practiced, and we've all worked together, and we all know the plan, and we've trained up, and we can also compost the remaining carcasses inside the houses. So that's another issue that got delayed in the Midwest. Frankly, they're trying to figure out what to do with the birds once they depopulated them. So the majority of flocks at risk, we have a really good, solid plan, and we can do it fast. Layers, we have very few layers. We have about 5 large layer houses, and we're working with them on biosecurity and depopulation plans, but it is more difficult, as Bill says. So we don't have the confidence that we can do it by supper time, I will say that, and we will need more people than they normally employ there, but we have the commitment from broiler industries to assist at any flock that has a problem because we're all in it together. And if we take care of the first flock, everyone else is safer. So we have very few other types, and we will work to make them clean, stamp out the disease, whatever flock it is.
Don, it's my understanding in the Midwest there were some 220 farms affected. They could have been turkeys, egg-laying birds, backyard birds, or waterfowl. There were some broiler chicken farms in the midst of some of those operations. I don't believe any of them were positive for the virus. That may have been luck. That may have been good planning.
Well, their houses are more closed. They're tighter. Turkey houses commonly have an open window system for air, of that kind of ventilation, and layers are multi layers or cages. So there's just it's a different setup. Broilers are sort of an enclosed house with a ventilation system that goes through, but not. You can close down the window so you don't have as much exposure outside.
I'm going to turn to, by the way, something that Bill mentioned, which was the right. We have the growers, but we obviously have the folks like Purdue and Tyson and so on, right? So, and what is to the growers, both Lee and Bill? What has been, as far as you're concerned, the response by these folks, and how much responsibility, or hopefully maybe help, perhaps, you might expect to get from them if this thing really does hit us hard? Bill, what do you think? I mean, have you been in discussion with folks like Purdue and Tyson or whatever? What's the feel there?
Yeah, the integrators are all encouraging as contract growers to attend some biosecurity sessions that are being held on the shore. In addition, the integrator I grow for provides a newsletter, and certainly the company veterinarians have had some very good information in that. And again, it's somewhat repetitious. You know, biosecurity is not an exciting subject, but right now it's got a lot of folks. It's got a lot of people's attention, and so it's a real learning opportunity, I think. But yes, certainly the integrators are sending letters home, newsletters, encouraging us to attend education. You know, to look at what we can do to another level to improve our biosecurity. So, yeah, the integrators are in the canoe with us.
Are you confident that if this hits, that they will be able to also, in some fashion, step up financially?
Yes, they are incentivized to take care of their growers, and so they certainly have our back. Now, with that being said, I mean, we've never. You need to understand, this break in the Midwest was a historic event.
Right.
We've never seen disease to this point, and it will probably be written up in veterinarian journals and so forth and so on. So, we're growing birds in a 50-mile by 100-mile box here on Delmarva, and so we are a monoculture, a broiler monoculture, which is an advantage. But if we had something to the extent of what the Midwest have, you're talking about a lot of indemnity and a lot of dollars.
What's it too, Lee? What about this idea of the what kind of cooperation you're getting with these integrators, and do you think there's a backstop at all? I mean, you seem to be like you're in a fairly decent position because you don't have a mortgage.
Well, yeah, but there's a lot of them to do, and we certainly are concerned about them too. But I think the poultry companies, will definitely stand behind us. I mean, we're the ones that raise the birds, so they need us,
right? Exactly,
just as much. My probably biggest concern is if it did get catastrophic like the Midwest, is can the poultry companies manage it? Can they financially manage it? If it hits that hard, that big, I have confidence that they will eradicate it. As soon as it's found and stuff, and hopefully, control it, and we can, get through it and all that. One question I have is, and maybe she can answer, is what do we look like after this year? If we get through this year, is it something that's going to recur every year?
Joe, what about that?
Well, I actually have some people who study that sort of thing who think we might not even get it this year. These strains do mutate all the time. If we don't let it become endemic, as it is in some, in Asia, this part of the strain came from Asia, and they have. Unfortunately, it's become endemic in places like China. They have 8 different strains that are endemic there. Once it becomes endemic, it's very, very hard to get rid of a disease that's just passing through every bird everywhere. So if we knock out this one this year, and maybe we knocked it out in the spring, I don't want to count on that, but we haven't had reports of it being detected up north yet. There's a chance it could mutate into something less virulent. Diseases don't want to kill their host, or they kill themselves. So diseases tend to mutate into something that can live within a population. So I'm crossing my fingers that maybe it will go away and not come back, or mutate into something less virulent.
Well, we've been speaking with Bill Satterfield. He's the Executive Director of the Delmarva Poultry Industry Incorporated Regional Trade Group. Also, Dr. Joe Chapman, the Assistant State Veterinarian at the Maryland Department of Agriculture, and our growers, Lee Richardson and Bill Brown. We appreciate you all taking the time to stop by and talk about this important issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, view the daily times, or visit pac14.org.